Hi, welcome. This is Final Fantasy I'm Lost series, and it's going to be where I'm going to cleanly go through all the Final Fantasy games so that you know whether or not you're interested in trying and playing these titles in this massive franchise. Alright, let's go. This is my intro guide. Alright, I will give a simple synopsis of the plot. I will give an A through D grade objectively on the story, gameplay, and difficulty/fun. I'll also give you the estimated time to complete the main story and the estimated time to beat the game 100%. The grades are meant to represent what is the strongest attributes when it comes to the game's design, not necessarily whether the game is good or bad. And this is another kind of little note on what you'll see. The critical notes, the overall time to finish, and a link to the trailers. So, Final Fantasy 1, the original. That originally came out in 1987. Well, as more recently, it's been remastered to 2021, where and it's an old school classic of what RPGs are. It was originally created by the studio Square and published by Square Enix. Even matched and surpassed Square Enix's original RPG called Dragon Quest during the 80s. It's one of the original first RPGs to really get the genre popular. Final Fantasies 1 through 6 are in a bit of a time capsule, as it's definitely very clear that they came from the past and they aren't nearly as flashy as the newer games. The Pixel remaster for Final Fantasy 1 through 6 came out on the Nintendo Switch and PC primarily. The plot of is basically, in synopsis, is 4 warriors of light are deemed to go on a journey, find crystals, defeating mythical fantasy monsters to earn those crystals, and save the world from darkness. These are my grades. I give the story a grade B, the gameplay a grade A, as it defined its time period. Difficulty and fun, A minus, because it's definitely challenging a little. Final Fantasy 1 through 6 went through a art form change from 8-bit to fully colored sprites in the Pixel remaster. And what I mean specifically by this, Final Fantasy 1 has the most remastered versions, at least on pretty much almost every console possible within the past previous console generations, at least on one of them. As of right now, the most common ones you'll find them Final Fantasy 1 on is DS Lite, PSP, and most recently on the PC, the Pixel Remaster. Time to play, as you can see, is 17.5 hours for the main story and 36 hours for the 100%. And as we get along here, I'm not going to read the time to play off. I'll just let you read it yourself. Final Fantasy 2 is a plot change. And a little background on this Final Fantasy title is this one was originally the first Final Fantasy title to be ported and localized for Western gamers, and Square and Square Enix both kind of concluded that they wanted to make the game less difficult than the first game, and they wanted to make it welcoming to those who may be experiencing RPG the first time. So, of course, as a result, the playtime represents that. It's got a little bit more, of course, quantity of gameplay in length than the first game, but it also isn't super nearly as long as what you'll see in future titles. And yes, it's part of the Pixel Remaster collection. Final Fantasy III, also a part of the Pixel Remaster collection, is a cycle back to the first game's plot, where it's 4 waves of light that need to find crystals and save the world. It's much more refined in terms of UI, and it's starting to bridge into a 2.5 HD in terms of art style. The start of the ATB system when it comes to magic and more powerful spells, making the game be more tactical and less just mash commands to speed through the game. The story finally kind of opens up more than just kind of a generic main character plus three other heroes save the world, and also more characters to play as in this game, in this title. And slowly, essentially, Final Fantasy is fleshing out the RPG genre, and this is the growth of RPGs, essentially, the major kind of first pinnacle. And now we're getting to 3D remakes that came out a lot later, and it's essentially was a fresh, cool take on expands on the storytelling of the original Final Fantasy 3 game, and however, it comes at the cost of the original storytelling as we learn more about the four main characters and less about the overall plot. The class system in these first three Final Fantasy titles is still prevalent and still very much a big part of the game. But as you'll notice, I rated the story a B, the gameplay a B, and the difficulty a C because we're still in this area of mid-30s where it's not too long. But as you'll notice, the 100% completionist time has started to really balloon larger. Final Fantasy IV, another cool plotline, and it's basically a redemption-ish plotline where the heroes are having to overcome their own kind of struggles, and you get to experience their growth. Still a multi-platform title, still a 2D RPG Warriors of Light 4-man team, although there are several more characters that show up as guests. Story definitely starting to reach its peak in terms of Final Fantasy storytelling. Gameplay, I'm going to give it a little bit weaker because there's a lot of confusing mechanics that can make it challenging. And the overall difficulty / fun, I would say would be a D, just because it's a little bit outdated in terms of just visuals and gameplay. And the time to beat the game is a lot shorter than its predecessors. Another kind of great entry point to start the Final Fantasy franchise if you aren't kind of grasping that already. They also remastered Final Fantasy 3D and 4 in 3D. It's kind of a similar critical opinion to Final Fantasy 3's 3D remake release. Despite an attempt to try, it's basically an attempt to kind of cash in on the fan base, while also trying to supply the fans with more content. This is, I think, a kind of growing pain period where Square Soft and Square Enix were kind of scrambling to try and figure out what they want to do with the franchise. Moving on, Final Fantasy V, I would say, is a major kind of growing peak with the Final Fantasy series as it takes a very interesting take with the RPG, making consistent challenging challenges for the player to play through, and it's a very great Final Fantasy game if you're interested in a challenging first raw run through the game, and it's a great example of what RPGs bring to the table. Final Fantasy VI is probably the pinnacle and peak of what is the first Final Fantasy VI games. It essentially brought the highest level up to this time in terms of graphics, stories, telling, and gameplay, and it really expands on the original concept of having four warriors fighting off the darkness and bringing light back to the world, and it shows it in a very respectful way to its original first game, and I think it does that in a way that will allow people to continue to want to keep playing this franchise. Now moving on, Final Fantasy VII was a critical game within the Final Fantasy franchise as it made Final Fantasy officially in gaming history iconic and identifiable to all gamers. Story was really great, in my opinion, as it very differentiates from the classical fantasy and fiction D&D-ish style of gameplay, and it starts really explaining what 2.5D characters can do on an overhead kind of camera looking down camera point. And it really excels in gameplay as it starts bringing in and expanding on the whole idea of like ATB gauges, timing, and overall challenging gameplay that keeps the player very engrossed in the gameplay. I would definitely say this is a must play within the Final Fantasy franchise. And and has a lot of critical reception in a positive sense. More recently, a Final Fantasy VII remake has been in the works, and this is going to be primarily focused on the first part of 3, and it covers essentially the first 2 to 3 chapters of the original Final Fantasy VII. The story is a little weaker, the gameplay though is beautiful, and the overall difficulty of the game I would say is around a D, and as you can tell from the times, it's very representative of that grade. Another great experience if you're trying to enter or learn more about the Final Fantasy franchise in terms of what it is. Final Fantasy VIII is a great example of expanding on both art style and gameplay, as it's starting to use more 2D-ish still backgrounds for the gameplay, but we start bridging closer and closer to the 3D art style. And the story, I give an A- because it's cool, new, but it's not as great as its older past games, and it's a little too long in my opinion. The gameplay is still the classic, fun, great, exciting game that comes with fun game mechanics. Difficulties in A because we are starting finally to hit the 40 the in longer main stories. Final Fantasy IX is a perfect example of probably where for a while Final Fantasy as a franchise flattens out and becomes a little bit overrated just simply because the cast in this game is a little bit bloated, which also leads to a longer game, and the story a little bit suffers as you're trying to learn about more than 4 characters, which starts bringing out multiple tangents within the game. However, that being said, the fun and difficulty of this title is a lot more than I would say others, as the graphic fidelity of this game is a lot better, and it also feels a lot more love and attention story-wise went to Final Fantasy IX over many of its predecessors, with the exception being Final Fantasy VI. Final Fantasy X is the critical kind of opinion on it is it's the first Final Fantasy game to really go full head over heels into what a modern Final Fantasy game has, and that's 3D graphics with no longer models showing their polygons and sharp edges. The characters look like real humans, friends, and this is definitely another one of the 3, I would say, pinnacles of what Final Fantasy is. I'll rephrase that. 4 big pinnacles, because as we'll see in the point up here, there were some great games and some not so games, I'd say. But to the point, Final Fantasy X is great story, great gameplay, and great kind of difficulty pacing. Unfortunately, it was not very game changing when it came to video games, and thus it's not particularly talked about or or It didn't make a lot of noise when it came out, so it's a little bit of a forgotten Final Fantasy game, but definitely worth experiencing. Final Fantasy 10-2, and this is kind of the unique thing about the Final Fantasy 10 games is that it's the first Final Fantasy to have a proper sequel within its own storyline. Once again, a major pinnacle of the Final Fantasy franchise alongside its 10 counterpart. Great story, great gameplay, and difficulty and fun. I would rate it an A because while it's not as long as its predecessor, it, there's tons of content with it, and it's a guaranteed satisfactory experience for you, the potential player. Final Fantasy XI has a lot less going for it. It was the first massively online multiplayer online role-playing game for Final Fantasy franchise. Started rated B, gameplay B, and difficulty B. Despite though its main story has ballooned to 106 hours roughly. Final Fantasy XII is essentially the end and true pinnacle of the RPG quote unquote purpose of Final Fantasy. It really brought out kind of the true colors of what makes Final Fantasy a great game. However, it's a huge investment in terms of time, nearly doubling most of its predecessors at 61 hours, and its difficulty and challenge and fun. Unfortunately, to complete the game 100% is a crazy 160 hours estimate. In other words, a game that will definitely take you close to half a year probably to finish 100%. Final Fantasy 13. This is where kind of Final Fantasy went off in a strange tangent. The game itself is good, but the storytelling really took a backseat, and the gameplay and animations are really what saved this game. It's essentially a classic rebelling against the government and the military style story that's very reminiscent of Final Fantasy VII. However, the game essentially dumps us in the middle of the plot line, and we have very little clue of what's going on. And that's probably the major critical opinion. Is it's thrilling, fast-paced. However, it lacks an introduction, and its only real good point is the kind of new combat system. However, it suffers is in the fact that the combat system isn't well explained. Final Fantasy 13-2, it's essentially an expanded take on what made Final Fantasy 13 its first part of its trilogy cool and unique. It expands on the fighting system, and it's a kind of multiverse timeline story. So it gets really confusing. Hence why I graded the story a C, the gameplay an A, and the difficulty an A, because it's pretty complex to get a full grasp on what's going on, and despite the gameplay really holding up nicely. Finally, Final Fantasy 13-3, Lightning's Return. The critical kind of opinion on this game is it's a strange conclusion to the trilogy, and it focuses on the time aspect of the second and third game. However, this comes, unfortunately, with it inconsistent storytelling, the same issues from its second part of its trilogy, and it's a disappointing conclusion to the Final Fantasy 13 games. Story I rate a C, gameplay I rate a C, and difficulty I would rate an action A. And why I would say this game is more difficult than many of its predecessors is they went with an unusual merging of controlling lightning by the player, and the ATB system for combat, and it just does not work kind of whatsoever if you don't understand the ATB action bar system, and it's just a complete mess. And because and as a result, it becomes incredibly challenging to play this game. In which case, I would say these estimations are gameplay to beat the main story, and the 100% the game are way off, and it should be way higher. And I would definitely say do not invest much time in this title, in my opinion. And I think what a lot of the fan base would also agree on is this was just a disappointing game that does not meet the standards of its predecessors whatsoever. But thankfully, after Final Fantasy 13, we get Final Fantasy 14, and it has critical reception. It revolutionizes itself, and its story is pretty good, despite some of it coming off as visual novel reading. The gameplay is exciting and fun. I would say, though, the combat difficulty is not very intense. However, the raids save it, and it has an amazing about 120 hours of main story to this game, not including the expanded plot lines from all the event raids. A definite must play if you're getting into Final Fantasy XIV, and if you're looking for a great time sink in terms of games, this is a must buy. Also, the community is outstanding, despite being an online MMO. Oh. And then finally here we have Final Fantasy 15. The critical kind of opinion is this is a good entry point for the franchise, despite skipping around with storytelling. And it's clearly the plot line is a collection of concepts rather than a fully fledged start to end storyline, and it has a it leans heavily on its outside material related to a Final Fantasy 15 movie rather than telling the story all within the game. I would rate the story a B minus. It's alright, not the worst that has come to Final Fantasy. Gameplay a B plus, and the difficulty a minus, but it's fast and fun. I would say definitely take a chance if you haven't played any Final Fantasy games. This is also another great entry point within the franchise, and I hope this guide has helped you. Thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, and give me feedback on this video. And this is a guide to the Final Fantasy franchise that will be easy, quick, and you can get an overview of all the games. Final Fantasy 15, story-wise in terms of plot, is basically a classic young prince doesn't know what he's doing, and he's desperate to find his own purpose in life type of plotline. Alright, have a fantastic day and week. I will see you sometime later. Have a fantastic day. Goodbye.